Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, gazing out of the frost-covered window at the quiet street outside. The late autumn sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting a golden glow that seemed to mock the cold emptiness inside her. The world had moved on without George. It had been 5 long years since her husband passed away, yet his absence still echoed in every corner of their home. The chair by the fireplace remained unoccupied. His favorite mug sat untouched on the kitchen shelf, and the familiar scent of his cologne had long since faded. Life, as Eleanor knew it, had become a quiet, colorless routine of lonely meals and restless nights. And then the dreams began. The first time, Eleanor dismissed it as a fleeting memory brought on by her longing. In the dream, she was standing in a meadow bathed in warm, golden sunlight. The air was fragrant with wildflowers, and a soft breeze carried the distant sound of birdsong. In the center of the meadow stood an enormous oak tree, its sprawling branches reaching toward the heavens. Beneath its shade stood George, his face illuminated with the same boyish grin that had captivated her all those decades ago. He looked just as he had in their younger days, strong, healthy, and full of life. He raised a hand in greeting, his lips moving as if to speak, but no words came. Eleanor tried to move closer to bridge the distance between them, but her feet felt heavy, as though rooted to the ground. Before she could reach him, the dream faded, and she awoke to the dim light of dawn streaming through her curtains. It was just a dream, she told herself. But when it happened the next night, and then the night after that, she began to wonder. The meadow, the tree, and George were always the same, as if her mind were replaying the exact scene on an endless loop. Yet each time there was something faintly different. His gestures grew more urgent, his expression more intense. He seemed to be trying to tell her something, but the words remained just out of reach. Eleanor started waking up in tears, her chest tight with a longing that felt almost unbearable. She began to notice small details she hadn't paid attention to before. The oak tree in the dream, it wasn't just any tree. It seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen it. And George's expression, it wasn't just joyful. There was something else in his eyes, something that looked like a mix of longing and sadness. The dreams began to consume her thoughts during the day. She found herself sketching the meadow on scrap pieces of paper, trying to capture the golden light and the way the tree's branches stretched like arms embracing the sky. She even tried speaking aloud to George in the hopes that, somehow, he could hear her. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered into the quiet of her room, the sound of her voice swallowed by the silence. One morning, as she sipped her tea by the kitchen window, something strange happened. The radio, which she hadn't touched in months, crackled to life on its own. At first, she thought it was a technical glitch, but then the familiar strains of Unchained melody filled the room. Her heart clenched. It was their song, the one they had danced to on their wedding night, the song George would hum when he held her close on quiet evenings. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the edge of the counter, overcome by the vivid memories the music conjured. It felt like a sign, but of what? The song lingered in her mind all day, drawing her thoughts to the attic, a place she had avoided since George's death. That night, as the dream unfolded again, George seemed even more urgent. He stepped closer this time, his hand outstretched as if urging her to follow. But just as her fingers brushed his, the dream dissolved, leaving her with an overwhelming sense of loss. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding. She knew this was no coincidence. George was trying to reach her, through the dreams, the song, perhaps even the stillness of the house. But why now, after all these years? Determined to understand, Eleanor spent the next day poring over old photo albums and letters, looking for anything that might explain the recurring dream. The attic called to her, a silent reminder of the boxes she had packed away but never dared to open. Among them was the old cedar chest George had brought into their marriage, its brass hinges worn but still sturdy. She had never opened it, It felt like trespassing into a part of him that belonged only to the past. But now something about that chest felt different, almost as if it were waiting for her. That night, Eleanor climbed into bed with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. When the dream came, as she knew it would, she didn't hesitate. She stepped toward George with all the resolve she could muster, determined to uncover whatever it was he was trying to show her. But, as always, the dream ended just as she reached him, leaving her alone in the dark, her mind racing. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a single thought looping through her mind. Whatever this is, it's not just a dream. It's a message. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something in her home held the key to understanding the dreams. The sensation was as though the walls themselves were whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. She began spending her days wandering from room to room, her fingers trailing across old furniture, her eyes scanning shelves she hadn't touched in years. It was almost as if her home, so familiar and yet now strangely foreign, was alive with memories that had lain dormant since George's passing. Her search began in the living room, where countless evenings had been spent together. She thumbed through stacks of books on the shelf, pausing at the ones George had loved most. Inside one, she found a small pressed flower, brittle and delicate. It was from their first wedding anniversary. George had tucked it into the pages of his favorite poetry collection. The memory made her smile, but it didn't explain the dreams. She moved on to the side table, where their wedding photo sat in an ornate silver frame. George's eyes seemed to meet hers, his familiar warmth radiating from the photograph. "What are you trying to tell me, George?" she murmured aloud, half expecting the photo to answer. Days turned into a blur of small discoveries that felt both meaningful and maddeningly vague. A ticket stub from an old train journey fell from a drawer, bringing with it a memory of laughter and the scent of rain-soaked fields. A forgotten note tucked inside a kitchen recipe book read simply, "For a rainy day, my love." Eleanor felt as though she were piecing together a puzzle without knowing what the final image was supposed to look like. And then the music came again. It was a week after her first discovery of Unchained Melody on the radio. She had just finished her evening tea and was rinsing her cup when the soft, haunting notes began to play. But this time, the music wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the old record player in the corner of the dining room. Her breath caught as she turned to look. The record player had been George's pride and joy, but she hadn't touched it since he passed. It was unplugged. A shiver ran down her spine as the melody filled the room, and she sat frozen, unable to move until the final note faded into silence. The next day, Eleanor decided she couldn't ignore the attic any longer. She pulled down the ladder with trembling hands and climbed into the dim, dusty space. The air smelled of cedar and thyme, and shafts of sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating the chaos of forgotten boxes and trunks. Her gaze immediately fell on George's cedar chest, sitting in the far corner as though it had been waiting for her all along. With a deep breath, she crossed the attic and knelt before it. The brass hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing a collection of neatly packed items: George's old journals, a stack of faded photographs, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with her name written in his unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope, its paper fragile and yellowed with age. She hesitated, the weight of it almost too much to bear. "This is it," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. She opened the envelope with delicate care, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The words were brief, written in George's familiar scrawl. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you in person. There's something you need to know. Follow the oak tree." The oak tree. Her breath hitched as the image from her dreams came flooding back. She could see it so clearly now. Its massive trunk, its sprawling branches, the golden light that seemed to dance around it. But where was it? Why hadn't she recognized it before? The answer felt so close, just beyond her grasp, and the frustration gnawed at her. She read the letter again and again, searching for clues that weren't there. The oak tree. It had to be somewhere real. George wouldn't have left her this message without reason. That night, the dream came again, more vivid than ever. The meadow seemed brighter, the air heavier with the scent of flowers. George was there, standing beneath the oak tree, his smile tinged with sadness. This time he held something in his hands, a small carved wooden box. He gestured to her, holding the box out, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't reach him. She woke with a start, tears streaming down her face. "I'll find it, George," she whispered into the darkness. "I'll find the oak tree." The next morning, she began her search in earnest. She pulled out old maps of the area, tracing her finger along the green patches of forests and meadows. She scoured photo albums, looking for any image of a tree that matched the one in her dream. It felt impossible, like searching for a needle in a haystack, but she couldn't give up. The dream wasn't just a figment of her imagination, she was sure of it now. George was guiding her, and the oak tree was the key. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. As she flipped through an old album labeled "Our Early Years," a photo slipped free and fluttered to the ground. She picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. There it was, the oak tree. The photo showed a younger George standing beneath its branches, his arm around her waist. The meadow from her dreams stretched out behind them, just as she had seen it night after night. On the back of the photo, George had written a single word, Haven. Haven, she whispered, the name stirring a memory she hadn't thought of in years. It was the nickname George had given the meadow where they used to picnic in their early days of marriage. It was a short drive from their old hometown, tucked away in a forest clearing. Eleanor felt a rush of determination she hadn't felt in years. She knew where she had to go. Eleanor could hardly sleep that night, her mind racing with the revelation of the photo and the word Haven. It was more than a name. It was a promise, a place she and George had once called their own. She remembered the meadow vividly now, the way the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, the laughter they shared as they lay on a checkered blanket under the expansive oak tree. It was a place of peace, of love, and of beginnings. But why had George pointed her back there now, after all these years? And what was she supposed to find? These questions weighed heavily on her, filling her dreams with fragmented images of the meadow and George's solemn smile. By the time dawn broke, Eleanor was already awake, dressed, and seated at the kitchen table, poring over maps she had found in a dusty box. She traced her finger along the roads leading out of their small town, her heart pounding as she tried to pinpoint the exact location of Haven. The years had blurred her memory of its exact spot, but she was certain it was tucked away in a quiet clearing, somewhere beyond the old mill road. "It has to be here," she murmured, circling an area on the map. The thought of return to the place after so long filled her with both anticipation and dread. What if she was wrong? What if the meadow no longer existed? Armed with a map, Eleanor set out that morning. The drive was slow, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she navigated roads that seemed unfamiliar despite the countless times she had traveled them in her youth. The landscape had changed over the years. New houses stood where open fields once stretched, and paved roads replaced the dusty tracks she and George used to wander. Yet, as she turned onto Mill Road, a flicker of recognition sparked within her. The trees lining the road grew denser, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting light. Her heart quickened. She was getting close. It wasn't long before she came upon the narrow dirt path that veered off into the woods. The sight of it sent a jolt through her. It was overgrown now, nearly swallowed by the encroaching forest, but was unmistakably the path to Haven. Eleanor parked her car at the edge of the road, her pulse thrumming as she stepped out and surveyed the trail. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves, and the quiet hum of insects filled the silence. She hesitated for a moment, clutching her coat tightly around her, before taking her first step onto the path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the past was pressing down on her shoulders. But she pressed on, guided by a pull she couldn't explain. As she walked, memories flooded back with each rustling leaf and snapping twig. She remembered George's hand in hers as they strolled down this very path, his laugh echoing through the trees. She remembered the way he'd tease her for packing too much food for their picnics, only to eat every last crumb. The nostalgia was almost too much to bear, and she had to stop for a moment to steady herself, leaning against a tree as tears threatened to spill. "I miss you," she whispered into the stillness, her voice trembling. "I miss you so much." After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Eleanor emerged from the dense woods into the clearing. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The meadow was still there, untouched by time. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted hues of the surrounding forest. And there, in the center of the meadow, stood the oak tree. It was just as she remembered, its massive trunk gnarled with age, its branches stretching wide as if to embrace the sky. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to move, overwhelmed by the sight of it. The tree seemed to call to her, just as it had in her dreams. She approached slowly, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass. As she drew closer, she noticed something she hadn't seen in the dreams. A small wooden box nestled at the base of the tree. It was half buried in the soil, its edges worn and weathered. Her heart pounded as she knelt down and carefully dug it out, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The box was surprisingly light, its surface engraved with an intricate pattern of vines and leaves. She ran her fingers over the carvings, recognizing George's handiwork. He had always loved working with wood, crafting small treasures for her during their years together. With a deep breath, Eleanor opened the box. Inside, she found a stack of folded letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, along with a delicate gold locket she hadn't seen in decades. Her hand shook as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The familiar scent of cedar and old paper wafted up, bringing tears to her eyes. The letter began with George's handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, if you found this, it means I've succeeded in guiding you here. I know this must feel strange, and I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you by leaving. But there's something I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Something you need to know." Eleanor's vision blurred as she tried to read on, the words swimming on the page. She clutched the letter tightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What had George been hiding? And why had he gone to such lengths to bring her here? The answers were within her grasp, but for the first time, she felt afraid of what she might uncover. She sat there under the oak tree, the meadow stretching out around her, as the weight of the moment settled over her. Whatever this was, it was bigger than her dreams, bigger than her memories. It was the beginning of a truth she hadn't known she needed. Eleanor sat beneath the oak tree, her hands trembling as she held the first of the letters George had left behind. The meadow was quiet except for the soft rustling of the leaves overhead and the occasional chirp of a bird. The serenity of the setting contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside her. She unfolded the letter, her heart pounding in her chest, the familiar scrawl of George's handwriting bringing a lump to her throat. She ran her fingers over the paper, as if touching his words might somehow bring him closer to her. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, but you already know that. What you may not know is how much I struggled with leaving you without saying the things I should have said. There are parts of my life I kept hidden, not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't know how to share them. I hope you can forgive me for what I am about to tell you." Eleanor's breath hitched. The The words felt heavy, as though they carried the weight of something that could append everything she thought she knew about George. She pressed on, her eyes scanning the page with a mix of dread and urgency. Before I met you, Eleanor, there was someone else, a life I thought I had left behind. But life doesn't let you bury the past so easily. I tried to keep it separate, thinking it was the right thing to do, but now I see how wrong I was. There's something you need to know, and I can only hope that when you learn the truth, you'll find it in your heart to understand why I did what I did. Eleanor's hand shook as she lowered the letter. Her mind raced with questions. Someone else? A life he thought he had left behind? What could he mean? George had always been an open book, or so she had believed. They had shared everything, or so she had thought. The idea that he had kept something so significant from her felt like a betrayal, but more than that, it felt impossible. This was George, her George, the man who had loved her so deeply, so completely. How could there have been a part of him she didn't know? Her fingers hovered over the next letter, but she hesitated, fear rooting her to the spot. She looked around the meadow, at the golden sunlight filtering through the branches of the oak tree, and tried to steady herself. This place, this moment, had been carefully orchestrated by George. He had known what he was doing when he left these letters for her to find. Whatever the truth was, he had wanted her to know it. That thought gave her the strength to pick up the next letter. The oak tree has always been a place of peace for me, a sanctuary where I could think clearly and feel close to the things that mattered most. I brought you here because this is where it all began, and it's where it should end. There is a cabin nearby, tucked away in the woods, that holds the answers you seek. You may not remember it, but we passed it once during one of our early picnics here. I told you it was abandoned, and we never gave it another thought. But it wasn't abandoned, Eleanor. It was mine. A cabin. Eleanor searched her memory, but it was a blur. She vaguely recalled George pointing out a weathered structure during one of their trips to the meadow, but it had seemed so insignificant at the time. Why hadn't she questioned it? Why hadn't he told her then? She looked back at the letter, her pulse quickening. Inside the cabin, you'll find the rest of the story. I don't want to overwhelm you with everything all at once, but it's important that you go there. I've left more for you to discover, and I trust that you'll understand why I couldn't tell you sooner. I love you, Eleanor, more than words can ever express. Please remember that, no matter what you find. The letter ended there, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers. She clutched the paper to her chest, her eyes brimming with tears. George's words echoed in her mind. No matter what you find, what could he have possibly left for her in that cabin? What secrets had he carried with him all these years? The thought of discovering them both terrified and compelled her. Eleanor stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked toward the edge of the meadow. If there was a cabin, she had to find it. She folded the letters carefully, placing them back into the wooden box along with the locket, and tucked it under her arm. The weight of the box felt heavier now, as though it carried not just George's secrets, but the burden of her own doubts and fears. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Whatever was waiting for her in that cabin, she couldn't turn back now. As she stepped into the shadowy woods, the air grew cooler, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. The path was faint, almost invisible, but she felt an unshakable certainty that she was moving in the right direction. Her footsteps crunched on the forest floor, the sound eerily loud in the stillness. She clutched the box tightly, her heart pounding with every step. The cabin wasn't far, she could feel it, as though George's presence was guiding her. And then there it was. The cabin stood nestled among the trees, its wooden exterior weathered and gray, its windows dark and lifeless. It looked abandoned, just as George had said all those years ago. But now, standing before it, Eleanor felt an inexplicable connection to the place, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and pushing open the creaky door. The air inside was cool and stale, heavy with the scent of aged wooden dust. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it felt strangely alive, as though it held its breath in anticipation of her arrival. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, taking in the simple table, the old rocking chair, and the bookshelf lined with faded journals. Her gaze landed on a small box sitting on the table in the center of the room. It was identical to the one she had found beneath the oak tree. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the realization dawning on her that this was only the beginning of the secrets George had left behind. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor approached the small box sitting on the table. Her fingers hovered above it, trembling as if the very act of opening it might set something irreparable into motion. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, saturated with the weight of time and secrets that had lain dormant for decades. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Slowly, she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed papers tied together with a piece of twine. Nestled beneath them was a photograph, and when Eleanor picked it up, her breath caught in her throat. It was George, unmistakably younger, standing beside a woman Eleanor had never seen before. The two of them stood close, their smiles bright and intimate, as though they shared a bond that went far beyond friendship. The background was unfamiliar, a small house with a white picket fence, surrounded by a garden bursting with wildflowers. Eleanor turned the photo over, her hands trembling, and read the words written on the back in George's handwriting, "With love, George and Margaret." 1953. Margaret, she whispered, the name foreign and heavy on her tongue. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor as her mind raced. Who was this woman? And why had George never mentioned her? Eleanor felt a pang of hurt, sharp and sudden, as the realization set in. This woman had been important to him, so important that he had kept a photograph of her hidden all these years. She sank into the old rocking chair, her knees weak, and stared at the stack of papers tied with twine. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to know more. But the letters at the oak tree had brought her here, and the photograph was only the beginning. Whatever George had left behind, he had wanted her to find it. With a deep breath, Eleanor untied the twine and unfolded the first sheet of paper. It was a letter written in George's familiar handwriting, dated years before she had met him. "My dearest Margaret," it began, and Eleanor's chest tightened. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you and the life we could have shared. I still remember the way your laughter filled the garden, the way your hand felt in mine as we dreamed of a future together. Leaving you was the hardest decision I ever had to make, but I hope you can understand why I had to do it." Eleanor's fingers gripped the paper tightly as she continued to read, her emotions a chaotic swirl of confusion, sadness, and anger. George's words painted a picture of a love she had never known, a love that existed long before their lives had intertwined. He and Margaret had been together for years, their lives deeply entwined, but something had forced them apart. Eleanor turned to the next page, desperate for answers. "Margaret, I thought I could escape the pain by starting over, but no matter how far I go, I can't forget you. I hope you found happiness, and I pray you can forgive me for the choices I made. I want you to know that, wherever you are, a part of me will always belong to you." The words blurred as tears filled Eleanor's eyes. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling as though the foundation of her life had cracked beneath her. How could George have carried this secret with him for so long? How could he have loved someone so deeply and never told her? She wiped her tears, her mind racing with questions. Was Margaret still alive? Did George ever see her again after they parted ways? And why had he chosen to tell her now after his death instead of during their years together? She reached for the next letter, unable to stop herself, even as her heart ached with every word she read. This one was addressed to no one in particular, dated many years after the first. I never told Eleanor about Margaret. I don't know if I ever will. What would she think of me if she knew? I built a life with her, a life I wouldn't trade for anything. But Margaret was my first love, and some part of me will always wonder what might have been. It's a selfish thought, I know, but it's the truth. I only hope Eleanor can forgive me for keeping this part of my life hidden from her. I never wanted to hurt her, but I couldn't bring myself to share this burden. Eleanor's hand shook as she set the letter down. Her heart ached with a mix of betrayal and compassion. She thought of the George she had known, the man who had loved her fiercely, who had been her rock through life's ups and downs. She thought of his kindness, his laughter, the way he had always made her feel like the most important person in the world. And yet, there was this other side to him, a side she had never seen, a part of his heart that had belonged to someone else. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin, Eleanor sat in silence, the letters spread out before her. She felt as though she were standing at a crossroads, torn between anger and understanding, between the past and the present. George's words echoed in her mind. I only hope Eleanor can forgive me. Could she forgive him? Could she reconcile the man she had loved with the man who had kept such a monumental secret? She wasn't sure. But as she looked around the cabin, at the remnants of a life she had never known, she felt a strange sense of peace. George had chosen to share this part of himself with her, even if it was too late for him to tell her in person. He had trusted her to find the truth and perhaps to find closure. As she gathered the letters and placed them back in the box, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small notebook tucked beneath the stack of papers. She opened it, her curiosity piqued, and found that it was filled with George's handwritten notes. It wasn't just about Margaret, it was about Eleanor too. Pages upon pages were dedicated to her, detailing their life together, his love for her, and his regrets about the secrets he had kept. Tears streamed down her face as she read his words, realizing that, despite everything, George had loved her deeply, completely, and in a way that transcended the mistakes of his past. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Eleanor closed the box and held it tightly against her chest. The truth wasn't easy to bear, but it was hers now, a part of the man she had loved and the life they had shared. And as she stepped out of the cabin and into the cool night air, she knew her journey was far from over. There was more to uncover, more to understand, and perhaps more to forgive. Eleanor stepped out of the cabin into the fading light of the day, her heart heavy with the weight of George's words and the secrets she had uncovered. The forest around her felt different now, as though it, too, carried the echoes of the life George had lived before her. She clutched the box tightly against her chest, her thoughts swirling with questions about Margaret and the life George had shared with her. But one question burned brighter than the rest. Was Margaret still alive? The idea that Margaret might still be out there, carrying her own memories of George, unsettled Eleanor. She felt an ache that was equal parts curiosity and trepidation. George's letters had painted a picture of a love lost but never forgotten, a love that lingered in the shadows of their marriage. What would Margaret think of Eleanor if she even knew she existed? Would Margaret harbor resentment, or had she, too, moved on with her life? And most importantly, was Eleanor ready to confront whatever lay ahead? Back home, Eleanor placed the wooden box on her dining table and spent the rest of the evening poring over its contents. She reread George's letters, hoping to find a clue that might lead her to Margaret. It wasn't until she flipped through the small notebook she'd found in the cabin that she stumbled upon a note tucked between its pages, a faded piece of paper with an address scrawled in George's handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. The address was unfamiliar, but it was local, just a few towns over. Could this be where Margaret lived? Or perhaps it was where she had lived all those years ago. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down her coat and adjusting the scarf around her neck. Her reflection looked back at her, eyes filled with determination and a touch of fear. She wasn't sure what she would find at the address, but she knew she had to go. George had left her this breadcrumb for a reason, and she couldn't turn away from the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With the address scribbled onto a piece of paper in her pocket, she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. The drive was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound accompanying her thoughts. The countryside blurred past her, the autumn leaves painting the landscape in hues of gold and red. As she approached the small town, her nerves began to fray. What if this was a mistake? What if Margaret wasn't there? Or worse, what if she was? Eleanor shook her head, dispelling her doubts. She had come too far to turn back now. The address led her to a modest white house with blue shutters and a small, well-kept garden. Eleanor parked her car across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the house. It looked warm and inviting, the kind of place where life moved at a slower, gentler pace. For a moment, she considered leaving. She could drive away and pretend she had never found the address, never read George's letters. But then she thought of the oak tree, the cabin, and the words George had written just for her. He had wanted her to find this place. She couldn't ignore that. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped out of the car and approached the house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she climbed the steps to the front porch. The sound of her knuckles rapping against the door seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the afternoon. She waited, her breath shallow, as footsteps approached from inside. The door creaked open, and Eleanor found herself face to face with a woman who looked to be around her age, her silver hair neatly styled, her eyes bright but guarded. "Hello," the woman said, her voice warm but cautious. "Can I help you?" Eleanor hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Are you Margaret?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Yes, I'm Margaret," she replied slowly. "Do I know you?" Eleanor swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "My name is Eleanor," she said finally. "I was married to George." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching out like a chasm between them. Margaret's eyes widened, and she took a small step back, her hand gripping the edge of the door. "George," she said, her voice trembling. "You knew George." "I was his wife," Eleanor said softly, her heart aching as she saw the emotion flicker across Margaret's face. "He passed away 5 years ago." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't know," she murmured. "I hadn't seen him in decades. Please come in." Eleanor stepped inside, her nerves still raw as she followed Margaret into a cozy living room filled with framed photographs and knickknacks. Margaret gestured for her to sit, and they settled into armchairs across from each other. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. "George and I," Margaret began, her voice faltering. "We were together a long time ago. Before he met you, I assume. He left, and I never saw him again. I always wondered what had happened to him." Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening. "He wrote about you," she said, pulling the wooden box from her bag and setting it on the table between them. "He left letters, journals. He wanted me to find you." Margaret's hand hovered over the box, her eyes wide with wonder and pain. "He left this for me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "For us, I think," Eleanor replied. "There's so much I don't understand, Margaret. But I think he wanted us to find each other." As Margaret opened the box and began to read, tears spilled down her cheeks, and Eleanor felt her own eyes well up. The room was filled with the quiet sound of pages turning, the unspoken bond between the two women growing stronger with each word. They were strangers, yet they were connected by the man they had both loved. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that she wasn't just uncovering George's secrets, she was discovering a part of herself she had never known. The room was steeped in silence as Margaret gently closed the last letter and placed it back into the wooden box. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were rimmed with red from the tears she had shed. Across from her, Eleanor sat quietly, her own emotions still swirling from the revelations of the past hours. The tension between them had softened, replaced by a tentative understanding forged through shared pain and memories of the man who had loved them both. Margaret broke the silence first. "He always had a way with words, didn't he?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at Eleanor, offering a small, bittersweet smile. "Reading these, it's like hearing his voice again. I never thought I'd have that." Eleanor nodded, her own smile faint but genuine. "He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered," she said softly. "Even now, through these letters, it feels like he's still here." The two women sat in quiet reflection for a moment, their unspoken grief and love for George creating a bond neither of them could have anticipated. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "Margaret, can I ask you something? What was he like with you? I mean, before me?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant as she traveled back in time. "He was everything," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "We were young, so young, and we thought we had the whole world ahead of us. He was kind, patient, and he had this way of making you laugh even when you didn't want to. We dreamed of building a life together, getting married, having children, growing old side by side. But life doesn't always go the way you plan." Eleanor tilted her head, curiosity and sympathy mingling in her expression. "What happened?" Margaret sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the box. "My family didn't approve of George. They thought he wasn't good enough for me, that he couldn't provide the kind of life they wanted for me. They pressured me to end things, and for a while I resisted. But then my father fell ill, and everything changed. I felt trapped, like I had to choose between my family and George. In the end, I made the choice I thought was right at the time." Eleanor's heart ached at Margaret's words. She could see the pain etched into the other woman's face, the regret that lingered even after all these years. "And George, he just left?" Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "He was devastated. I told him I couldn't do it anymore, and he respected my decision even though it broke his heart. He said he'd always loved me, but he didn't want to make things harder for me. So he left, and I thought that was the end of it. I never imagined he'd carry me with him all these years." The weight of Margaret's story settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. She thought of the letters George had written, the pain and longing woven into his words, and the love he had shared with Margaret before their lives diverged. It was a love that hadn't diminished his love for Eleanor, but rather had shaped the man he became. Margaret turned to Eleanor, her expression thoughtful. "And you? What was he like with you?" Eleanor's lips curved into a tender smile. "He was my anchor," she said. "We met when I was at a crossroads in my life, and he gave me a sense of purpose, of belonging. He was steady, dependable, and so full of love. He made me feel like I could do anything, as long as we were together. We had our struggles, of course, but he always found a way to make things right. He was my best friend, my partner, my everything." Margaret listened intently, her eyes softening as Eleanor spoke. "He sounds like he never stopped being the man I knew," she said. "Even after everything, he carried that same love and kindness with him." The two women fell into a deep conversation, sharing stories and memories of George that spanned decades and continents. They laughed over his quirks, like his habit of humming off-key when he thought no one was listening, and they cried over the moments they missed, the years they couldn't share. For the first time, Eleanor felt a sense of closure beginning to form, as though the pieces of her life were falling into place. As the afternoon turned to evening, Margaret rose from her chair and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she held a small photo album in her hands. "I think you should have this," she said, placing it gently in Eleanor's lap. "It's filled with photos of George from the time we were together. I think he'd want you to see them." Eleanor opened the album slowly, her eyes scanning the black and white photographs of a younger George. He looked so vibrant, so full of life, his smile as familiar as ever. She felt a pang of longing, but also a deep gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than I can say." Margaret placed a hand on Eleanor's arm, her grip firm yet comforting. "He brought us together for a reason," she said. "Maybe to help each other find peace." Eleanor nodded, the truth of Margaret's words settling deep within her. George had loved them both in different ways at different times. And now, through their shared love for him, they had found a connection that transcended the years and the secrets that had once separated them. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the door. The two women embraced, their bond no longer defined by jealousy or sadness, but by understanding and mutual respect. "If you ever want to talk," Margaret said, her voice warm, "you know where to find me." Eleanor smiled, the weight on her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "I'd like that," she said. "I think George would too." As she drove home, the sun dipping below the horizon, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since George's passing. She realized that rebuilding bonds wasn't just about mending the past. It was about finding new connections, new ways to heal, and new reasons to carry forward the love that had shaped her life. Eleanor returned home that evening with a heart full of conflicting emotions: sadness for the secrets George had carried, gratitude for the love they had shared, and a quiet sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She placed the photo album Margaret had given her on the table next to the wooden box, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the silence of her home envelop her. The journey she had embarked on felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't fully wake from. And yet, she knew it was far from over. That night, as she lay in bed, the recurring dream came again. But this time, it was different. Eleanor found herself in the familiar meadow, the golden sunlight filtering through the oak tree's branches, casting a warm glow across the grass. George was there, as always, but his expression was no longer tinged with sadness or urgency. Instead, his face held a kind of peace, a quiet contentment that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. She walked toward him, her steps steady and purposeful. For the first time, there was no invisible barrier holding her back, no sensation of being rooted in place. She reached him, heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and relief. George smiled at her, his eyes filled with the same warmth she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "You found everything I left for you," he said, his voice as clear and familiar as if he were standing right beside her in the waking world. "Thank you, Eleanor." She blinked, her eyes welling with tears. "Why now, George? Why did you wait until now to tell me all of this?" George's gaze softened, his smile tinged with a bittersweet edge. "Because I wasn't ready to let you go," he admitted. "Even after I was gone, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you with the weight of my secrets. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was holding you back. You deserve the truth, Eleanor, even if it was hard." Eleanor shook her head, her voice trembling. "You should have told me when you were alive. I would have understood." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I was afraid of what you might think of me, afraid of losing the love we shared. I thought keeping it buried was the best way to preserve what we had. But love isn't about hiding the truth. It's about facing it together. And I failed you in that." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks as she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered near his. "You didn't fail me, George. You loved me, and I loved you." That's what matters. Their fingers brushed, and for the first time in all the dreams she had experienced, Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch. It was fleeting, like the brush of a breeze, but it was enough. George's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the oak tree behind him. This place, this meadow, it was always our haven. I wanted you to find it again, to find the peace you deserve. And you did. Eleanor turned to look at the tree, its sprawling branches a testament to the strength and resilience of the love it had witnessed. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. George's expression grew serious, though his eyes remained gentle. Now you live, Eleanor. You've spent so many years carrying the weight of my absence, and now it's time to let go. The world is still out there, waiting for you. Margaret, your friends, your memories, they're all part of your story. And your story isn't over. Eleanor's chest tightened, a mixture of sorrow and hope swelling within her. I don't know if I can, she admitted. I don't know how to move on without you. You already have, George said softly. Every step you took to uncover the truth, every moment you spent rebuilding bonds and finding closure, that was you moving forward. And you'll keep moving forward, one day at a time. You're stronger than you realize, Eleanor. The meadow began to blur, the golden light growing softer, hazier, as though the dream itself were beginning to fade. Panic surged in Eleanor's chest, and she reached for George, her voice trembling. Wait, don't go. I'm not ready. George smiled, his presence as steady as the oak tree behind him. You are ready, my love, and I'll always be with you, in the memories we shared, in the love you carry with you. This isn't goodbye, it's just a new beginning. Before she could say another word, the dream dissolved, leaving Eleanor awake in her bed, her cheeks damp with tears. The room was bathed in the soft light of dawn, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of calm settle over her. She placed a hand over her heart, the warmth of George's touch still lingering in her memory. Eleanor rose from her bed and walked to the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the world in hues of gold. She thought of George, of Margaret, of the journey she had taken to uncover the truth. And she realized he was right. This wasn't an ending. It was a chance to begin anew, to carry forward the love and lessons of the past into the days that lay ahead. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned away from the window and began her day. The photo album sat on her dining table, waiting to be explored. The letters, the memories, the bonds she had rebuilt, they were all part of the foundation she would use to move forward. And as she prepared her morning tea, a small, knowing smile graced her lips. George was gone, but he had left her with a final gift, the courage to live, to love, and to embrace the future with an open heart. And for that, she would always be grateful.